Lee, what's the current state of drayage?
The current state of drayage is a challenge market. If you look at how things are working, the fuel cost increase is causing some uptick in drayage prices and rates. It's giving a challenge to the market in general, just like the truck issues are going on right now with really what I would call just a freight recession.
How concerned are you with the potential Israeli-Iranian war because the Strait of Hormuz, where all the oil's coming out that could cause diesel prices to spike astronomically?
I was looking at just some drayage rates yesterday, and I saw fuel surcharges between 15% and 34%. It's having a drastic impact in rates, and shippers and fleets are having to incur those costs. And what happens is that gets elevated, and that costs fuel surcharges go into rates. Somebody has to pay them.
But what if nobody pays it? Who can afford that? Because a lot of these companies are trying to go battery electric, but as Jim Mullen said on the previous Road to Autonomy Insight, 50% more for a battery electric truck. So 50% more for a battery electric truck, fuel surcharges up to 34%. I'm not an economist, but we're in a lose-lose market in that scenario.
And Grayson, it puts the squeeze on, right? Because shippers sense that. They go to their contract carriers and they say, look, I need another rate decrease. And the shippers are looking for the cheapest way to do business. And carriers are really in a tough spot because they're doing everything they can to function in this market. And they have to find ways to cut costs, right? Some of those things are very difficult decisions. It's maintenance. It's deferring some items. We're in a very cost-conscious environment right now. So the impact of what risk points we're talking about when you talk about increased rates, I think it's going to take that understanding from the shippers that we can't go back to rates that were before the pandemic. We went through this crush during the pandemic where, depending on what side of the industry you're on, we had somewhere between a 3 and 10-year growth cycle compressed during the beginning of that pandemic. So it pulled all this growth forward, and now you're seeing this trough of demand. And we're all trying to sit here and look and say, okay, is that demand going to return or what's going to be done? Well, some folks like shippers are look at that and say, okay, we need to go back to price points that were before the pandemic. Very unrealistic, not including just rise in fuel cost and what that's done to the market. You can't go back to those pre-pandemic price points, but that's unfortunately some of the viewpoints of the shippers saying, I just got to go back. I got to keep putting the squeeze on people. And it's really putting pressure on some of the relationships.
When does debt come into the factor? Interest rates are high, servicing the debt's expensive. A lot of corporations are going to have to refinance their debt. We're in a higher for longer rate environment. There's now the potential, can't believe I'm going to say this, that a rate hike is on the board now. Are these drayage operators struggling with debt? Are they able to meet their debt? Are they going to have to pass on those financing costs to their customers?
That's not my area of specialty, but I think the era of free money is done, right? Of low cost debt just doesn't exist anymore. So absolutely, everybody's re-looking at how to handle things and structure things the right way to give them a window to ride this out. This whole freight recession, what I think has caught everybody by surprise is the depth and the duration, how long it's lasted. I remember, back in 2022 when this was first hitting, okay, we'll ride out 2023, but it'll be better in 2024. Well, here we are in 2024, and we really don't have any better outlook. Some of the numbers that I've looked at, April, we've actually got even worse situations than the year before. So we're still in a very difficult freight environment, very difficult for debt structures. I think every fleet is really looking at their capital expenditures. How do we trim that? What steps can we take right now that position us better to carry out here these next 6 months? And let's get through these next 2 quarters of challenge.
We have to get to the next 2 quarters. We have to get into 2025 and see what's going to happen there. Chairman Powell and the Fed do. We're going to see what the freight market does. That's only one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is autonomy. What impact are autonomous trucks going to have on the drayage market? Are they Sir Lancelot? Are they the hero that saves the day?
Eventually, Grayson. So what's got to happen is when we first go commercialized and we begin to operationalize EV trucking, what you're going to see is either AV-owned terminals or partners. Ryder has some terminals that are in partnership with different AV providers. Kodiak has announced a partnership with Pilot. So you may get some launches and landings from pilots, from riders, and then from the trucking terminals. From that destination, you've got to move volume to the final destination. And they're going to be using manually driven trucks to do that drayage. So the economics of that has to make sense. Long term, what you're going to see is this transition from AV-owned terminals and these partnership terminals and truck port type facilities to a lot more of terminal to terminal type. markets. If you think of the big e-commerce players, it's Walmart, Amazon, UPS, FedEx, DHL, Target, all of those are going to want movements from distribution centers to distribution centers or from their big facilities to other big facilities accordingly. So that's going to put a lot of pressure on the AV truck providers to really provide terminal to terminal moves. There's 140,000 different locations where trucks come in and out. Not all of those are going to be able to be mapped and included in the launching and landing network, but the big facilities, the large facilities for these e-commerce players, they're going to get there. They're going to put pressure to do terminal to terminal. So that will begin to reduce the amount of drayage that has to be done. But still, the individual store deliveries, if I'm picking up 15 loads a day from Target and I'm delivering to 15 different stores in the Metroplex, say DFW, I still got to get them to the individual stores. I started as a truck driver and I backed up grocery stores and docks. Let me tell you, it's one of the most complicated areas to back up into and to properly do that safely. We're still going to need manual driver support in order to be able to execute. So that drayage component has got to be there. And frankly, it's a similar model to intermodal. Grayson, when you think about how that works, it goes from railhead to railhead. So I go from Phoenix, Arizona into DFW Metroplex. When that train grounds, those containers are moved on to loads and then they get carried to their final destination. I was looking at some rates from one of the railheads in Dallas yesterday. It was like $225 plus a 34% fuel surcharge for just a 34-mile run. If I'm only paying $1,000 for that railhead from Phoenix, Arizona into the Dallas area, where by truck I'd pay probably at least $2,000. So I've got $1,000 bucket financing. I can offset that drayage charge. So I could pay a $225 rate drayage charge for a 34-mile move in the intermodal business network because of the low cost. When containers move by rails, they don't move on a per mile charge. It's usually a negotiated rate between whoever's tendering that load over to the rail. But that $1,000 in the AV component could shrink. Let's say I'm saving 20 cents per mile. For those 1,000 miles, now I've only got $200 to pay for that drayage run. So that $200, that 225 crew I had on that drayage move for 34 miles would have turned that from a good business decision for that trucking company to use AV into a bad business decision. So they would leave that as a manual run. So what we've got to be very aware of is networks for the freight folks who are using AV. What changes need to be made to their networks now? What opportunity they have to consolidate and optimize their network? And for the AV providers, there's going to be pressure in just how close I can get to that final destination. Here's the thing that I would say. When you think about the product offering of AV trucking, there's a lot of focus right now on the stack and what it's going to do. But really, what offerings are going to be out there is how does that network really look like? How close are those launching and landing points? And product-wise, how quickly and how fast do I expand lanes? So I'm going to bring offerings where now we're really focused on the AV, but eventually as this matures and grows, we'll be focused on the network and the launching and landing capability and what's the timeline to increase the lanes and where they go.
Raises the question, the theory that I've thought about and publicly spoken about for years is the digital railroad. Do we get to a point sometime in history where Union Pacific, North Fork Southern, CSX, or BNSF acquires an autonomous trucking company, or does a partner, STG Logistics, which has a long-term partnership with Union Pacific, did they make an acquisition, acquire an autonomous trucking company, and integrate to create what I'll call a hybrid network where you have both the human-driven trucks and the autonomous trucks and deploy the ones that make the most economic sense depending on the route and the timing?
I absolutely agree with that. Right now, there is a optimum boundary. Let's call it 60 miles, maybe 80 miles, maybe 100 miles, where let's go back to that DFW railhead conversation that we just talked about. I may move a load up to Ardmore, Oklahoma from that railhead. But eventually, the railheads, in order to put a spur on or to expand, that is years of policy work, that's years of planning, and it is a big investment for them. It's hundreds of millions of dollars to expand rails, depending on how long that spur is. But if you think to the future, and 10 years from now, that a rail company where maybe their rail lines, the actual railroad ends in Memphis or Shreveport or Dallas, but they've got the capability to literally convert the EV opportunity V lane and put digital railroad tracks down for that volume to be transferred from the physical railroad to the virtual rail, what AV will provide. I absolutely see that happen because the class one rails no longer have to make this huge investment with rails in that spur line. What they do is create what's called a paper rail. They could tender loads at certain cities and destinations. And then it's a matter of movement from grounding that train and transferring it to the AV and being able to launch and land in close proximity to that railhead. Absolutely, Grayson. I think our future includes a synergized and integrated feed network with class one rails and AV trucking.
Could this be accelerated if Amazon or Walmart or Pepsi, for a matter of fact, acquired an autonomous trucking company integrated into their operations? Would that force the hand of a railroad potentially?
I think there's a lot of strategy people in those companies that are taking very hard looks. And they should, because you've got to get ahead of that future. Just as you see a lot of these large supply chain companies you talked about, looking at how do they optimize every opportunity they have, they've got to look at this in the totality of what's taking place. Where is volume coming from? That includes ocean freight. That includes port operations. That includes railheads. That includes trucking, and what that total opportunity is. And where does AV trucking fit into that sequence? I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. I think there's a tremendous amount of room for disruption. And maybe it's a big company. Maybe it's a brokerage. Maybe it's an asset light play that comes into this. There's people who are behind some of this AV leading edge that could literally disrupt and become large operators of multimodal networks. I think you're going to completely redefine what truly intermodal means when companies are really taking a hard look at their nearshoring efforts and how do they source product and where it's coming from.
We know change is going to come. You see the factories being built in Texas. You see the factories being built for chips in Arizona. If you bought it, a truck brought it. There's no doubt about that. The model's going to change. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is terminal to terminal. Lee, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy Insights today.
Thank you, Grayson. Thanks for having me.